Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Summer of Access webinar series. Welcome. As you're coming in today, please join us in the chat by saying hello, letting us know where you're calling in from. So welcome. Hello from Colorado. Hi, Deb. Welcome back. Hi from Michigan, Northern Michigan. Kate, welcome back. Hello from Texas. Hey, Gabby. Hello from California. Hello, Canada. Hello, Illinois. Excellent. Oh, so many cool people. So many cool places. Love it, love it, love it. Leah! Hi, Leah. It's been a while. I was thinking about you this morning. So great to have you join us. All right, everyone. So this is our final session of the summer series, Beyond Alt Text, Making Complex STEM Visualizations Accessible at Scale, brought to you by Latoile Education and the Accessibility Learning and Development Community. Just a couple of reminders as we get started here. We are in a Zoom meeting, not a webinar. Please stay muted unless we're in your speaking. You may use the chat or raise hand feature. We'll stick with the chat unless Kristen is going to ask you to come off mute. Otherwise, we'll use the chat here. Recordings will be shared in our Accessibility L&D Slack community following the session, and live captions and transcripts are available throughout. Let me introduce our presenter today. Christin Monroe, welcome Christin, Educational Research Associate at the Center for Innovation in Teaching and Learning at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, is that correct?
I just moved in December. Sure.
Okay,
So I Urbana-Champaign. Both.
sounds good.
Yeah.
Her work focuses on faculty development, STEM education, accessibility, neurodiversity, and evidence-based teaching practices in higher education. She collaborates with faculty and institutions to design inclusive learning environments, evaluate educational initiatives, and develop resources that support student success. Christin is an active researcher and presenter whose work explores topics including artificial intelligence in education, universal design for learning, experi experiential learning, and supporting neurodivergent students in higher education. Please join me in welcoming Christin to the Summer of Access. This is a topic I know people are very excited about and one we've been needing. So thanks so much for being here. Take it away.
Thank you. Um, I just need to, oh, there we go. Okay. Um, all right. Well, thank you for joining me today. I will say that, there is no magic bullet for alt text, especially for complex STEM visualizations. But I think that just having more conversations about it and knowing that uh, having some kind of alt text is better than not having any alt text at all. And that's really the take home message. But thinking about ways of communicating your context to your students or whomever you're communicating your topics to is really the most important thing. All right, so I'm going to talk about uh, sort of the origin of where this work came from, which is an open education resource that I worked on, I think, last summer. And I sort of innocently volunteered to write the alt text for all the figures for a molecular visualization text that I didn't realize it was going to be that many, but at the same time, it was a very good exercise and it got me really comfortable. And as I was going, I reflected, I made reflective notes on the process and then kind of made that into this presentation. And then I have a couple challenges to consider, and then a simple kind of framework to think about approaching alt text, and then we'll hopefully have room for the time for questions. So a little bit about me. I know you've already heard about me, but I will just say that I have a PhD in chemistry. And up until recently, up until December of last year, I worked at a college that exclusively serves neurodivergent students. And I'm also on the Chemists with Disabilities Committee for the American Chemical Society. And so I'm very tied to the to accessibility in STEM. That's something that I am very seeped in. Um, so the text that I'll be referring to is called Seeing the Invisible, Learning to Teach with Biomolecular Visualization. And again, it had about 200 figures in it. And I went through and did the drafting for the alt text. It was something where I had some expertise to do it, but it was really also collaborative with the individuals who created the figures to begin with to make sure that what they were doing was captured. Um, so, I think that alt text, alternative text, it's complicated, right? And there's a lot of information that you want to communicate to students, but um, it doesn't always get translated. Um, and as I mentioned, some alt text is better than no alt text, but you do want to have a general sense of what direction are you, what is the context for why you are showing that figure to students? What is the what are the key parts that you want the students to get out of it? And so it's useful to kind of have some questions to ask yourself in the beginning about what do you want the students to focus on. And the other thing to keep in mind is that alt text does, there isn't one type of alt text that you can do for a figure and be done. If I make a figure or I'm using a figure in my context, the alt text for that may not be the same as what someone else is using for a different context. So it's important to think about who your audience is when you are generating that alt text. And there's also times where things are decorative, and you can also do that as well. And you can check a box and say that it's decorative. So I think that there's a balance between getting, overly anxious about alt text, but also and thinking about communicating that basic information. So uh, I also want to highlight on this slide as well that alt text is not just for those that are blind or have low vision. Alt text is for all individuals that use screen readers. I do collaborate with a number of blind scientists, but coming from the background supporting neurodivergent students, I also do tend to see folks kind of lean on, oh, well, I'm making this figure for someone who can't see it at all. That's not necessarily the case. There are folks that have low vision that use screen readers that can see some of the image. And there are also folks that might be dyslexic who are using a screen reader who can also benefit. And I would also argue that if students alt text has the potential to really communicate things to all students. Because, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but typically you don't want the students, especially the novice students, aren't able to interpret all of those 1,000 words. So it kind of consolidates down what you want the students to focus on. And so I'm going to go through a few examples of, what did that? Oh, okay. Of what, of how you can tackle these things. So I know that many programs will have a limitation on alt text. In some cases, it you can override that, and in other cases, you have a strict limitation. I would say for complex figures, if you need to have longer alt text because it's a complex figure, that is actually not a bad thing. Keep in mind for folks that do rely on screen readers, they're typically building that picture in their head. And so the more information that you can have, they're listening to it and building that picture, the better. But if you are stuck on having a certain character limitation for alt text, you can also add a longer description to the figure, and have that as linked text as well. So there's other ways of getting around that. I tend to lean more on the side of if the detail is necessary, having longer alt text isn't the worst thing. But I know that that is also something that people kind of go back and forth with. Um, so, with a figure, this is one of the figures from the text. With a figure like this, there are certain things that you can capture, and there are certain things that you may not be able to, fully capture all of the different relations between these different images. And like I said, you can think about ways of adding a supplementary text, or in some cases, you might think about, is the figure complexity really necessary? Especially if it's a figure you're making yourself. Think about, am I able to capture what I want to capture in something that might be more simple? Another thing to consider when you are generating alt text is it can be helpful to verbally describe what you're trying to capture and do speech to text, and then look at that description and use that as a starting point to generate these types of things. I also have found that for figures that do tend to have text and are more things that are more common, like Venn diagrams, putting the figure into some AIs will give you pretty decent alt text. And also that can be a starting point. You can look at that and say, oh, yes, this gives the general idea, and then edit it from there. So that's another way, if you're willing to do so with a figure, to do that as well. But, thinking about, does the figure need to be as complex? What are the key messages? And again, as you're describing it, this happens to be a Venn diagram with 4 different disciplines that are represented, all with an overlapping sphere. And the 4 disciplines are biochem, cell bio, molecular biology, and structural biology. They all overlap with chemical and synthetic biology. And then on the 2 opposing sides, you have chemistry and biology. And so that is one way to start to describe a figure like that. Again, thinking about just describing it's a protein structure with various colors is not going to be enough to really capture what you want the students to know about the figure. So thinking about what is the purpose, what are the comparative aspects of this, and in this case, the goal of this is to really show that there are multiple ways of representing molecular structures. And so focusing on, in this case, I would recommend focusing on what are the differences between the structures and what is the overall purpose of that, of the figure, not necessarily getting into as much of the nuance of these different aspects of the figures. But again, going back to what is the purpose and how would you describe it? In this case, it's also useful to consider having, alt text for all 4 of the figures that is subsequent, knowing that there is a story being told by these figures together, and not separate them into 4 different figures that aren't interconnected. So a couple things about screenshots. The textbook that I was doing the alt text for had a lot of screenshots because it was a very instructional guide. And so one thing to think about is there a way that you can have the link directly to what you are showing, so that someone could take that link and get more of the details of the page. In this case, a lot of times it's just orienting, like this is what the page looks like, but for screen reader users, you're not going to be able to easily capture that. So having the direct link to the site can be really helpful so that the screen reader user can navigate in turn and engage directly with the website to make it more at the level that they decide to engage with the visual. It's also important to think about what are the important when you're doing a screenshot like the one I have on the screen that has several different text boxes and arrows. It's important to walk through in a specific order what the important information is for the person. Typically, and in this case, in the textbook, this did also align with a written step-by-step set of instructions as well. And so having that written step-by-step set of instructions is valuable, but making sure to highlight the important aspects of, things like the command log and the different places that are relevant to the student. If it's not in the text of the textbook and it's only in the figure, then that's where you run into the biggest problem, because the person who's using a screen reader is going to struggle to navigate that website unless they have the step-by-step instructions. So it's useful to consider, making sure that the accompanying text is also detailed. And then when you're creating figures like that, to really only highlight the things that are most important, because again, as the figure gets more complicated, there might be labels that are not as important in that moment. And you can actually start to see that when you're writing your alt text. It's actually helpful to go back and forth between creating the figure and writing the alt text to think about what are the details that are really most important for someone who's potentially engaging with both the figure and the alt text. And I think I had already, I covered this with the labels and making sure that if there's a label in the image, that it has to also be noted in the alt text. I'm just going to take a minute because I know that there's been some comments in the chat. If there's any questions, I'll just pause here and see if there are any questions. So if you want to pop those in the chat, I can just pause because I know I've presented a decent amount of information.
Can I unmute to ask a question, or would you prefer the
Yeah,
chat?
you can unmute to ask a question. That's okay.
Awesome. Good morning. One of the biggest questions I get in writing this alternate text in these more complex things is, what about giving away the answer? Have you found an approach that you can I find it's usually a case by case basis. And unfortunately, I have to instruct the faculty, I get what you're trying to ask, but it's not going to be possible given our current layout. So I'm definitely curious to your approach to that, Christin. And yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's, something that a lot of people face with education in general. I think that it is useful to consider what as you are visually describing it, you think about what things are in relation to one another. I think a lot about, chemical structures, and how you want to think about how they're connected to one another and describing the breakdown of it. I know it gets especially complicated with mathematical graphs when you want the student to notice that trend, and then you might give that, quote unquote, give that away. I actually find that in those cases, it can be more useful to use things like audio sonification, where the trend is sonified and will change sounds based upon the data that is being built in. Because then you're not giving away the information about the graph, but someone can engage with that content in a non-visual way. Um, it also gets a little complicated because it's something that the student has to kind of be familiar with, and so having exposure to that. But I think in general, it's just thinking about what are the spatially what breaking it down. And in some cases, you might also ask yourself is if you're simply asking a student to describe the figure, is that really what learning objective are you trying to meet with that? And going back to the learning objective is also a really useful thing to think about. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to assess? And that can kind of help sometimes as well. So that was sort of the kitchen sink of things. I hope that was helpful.
We have some more questions here
Love it.
in
Thank you.
the chat. Sorry, yeah, Sean. We have some more questions. Brooke asked, do we need to write screenshot as I thought it already read out image? Do you add the word screenshot? I've had this question before too.
I think it's helpful to know that it's a screenshot. It will say it's an image, but I think in that case, it noting that there is a that it is distinguished from a different type of image. Um, does that help with that?
Yep, and I'm just going to read off some of the other questions here. The image that contained four separate images, would it have been possible to do it as individual images? And I think that was the one where you wanted the
Yeah.
differences between, if you want to go back to that image on your slide and
Yes, this one. It is possible to do that as four separate images. In this particular case, in the context of what was trying to be communicated, they were trying to just highlight the differences between the figures. So you could describe them as four individual images. Um, and that's perfectly reasonable. I might even consider having the four different images, but then a kind of note at the end saying that they are that they're telling us a story, if that makes sense. Um, other questions?
there's a few more. I don't know if anyone wants to come off mute and ask their question directly, but you had a comment that Leo loves the reflection question. Is the figure complexity next necessary? Um, Weston has a question. Any advice on how to handle alt text with screenshots when the link needs to be authenticated into and searched in a database? In other words, just embedding the link, isn't straightforward.
Yeah, I think that that's one of those educational moments where it's going to be hard for all students, right? It's not just for the screen reader user, but any student that's trying to access that content might have that same challenge. And I think in those instances, it is helpful to consider, you know, is that the best thing? Is that the best example that you want to use for your students if there's a barrier to get into that particular content? Is there a better, at least for a starting point? In some cases, you can provide the direct link, but in other cases, it can be helpful to consider maybe there's a different alternative. But again, it is context dependent. So it's one of those things where if you are working with students who are more familiar with that website and you're halfway through the semester, then providing that as a link might be okay because they've already navigated to that website. If that's the first thing that you're showing to your students day one and they've never navigated to the website, then you might look for an alternative way for them to access that. Does that make sense?
We have a ton going on in the chat, but I think if you want to continue on, maybe
Okay.
we can, at the end,
Yep.
answer anything that doesn't get answered. It seems people are doing a nice job going back and forth, though. Yeah,
Awesome.
thanks.
All right. Let's see. So, let me figure out where I was. All right. So this is just a slide showing a multi-step process, and with several arrows. Um, in the text itself, the arrows are noted, and so the screenshot is really to, in this case, to supplement it, but it can be helpful to, again, go step by step through that process. In this case, I was a little bit concerned when they had multiple arrows that were all one. That might be confusing for students. But again, I would kind of go back to that idea of if you are struggling to write the alt text for a figure and you have control over that figure, is there a way that you can simplify it? Or again, clarify it in the text as well, because uh, you are most the individuals both engaging with the text and the alt text. So there's multiple ways that they are engaging with that content. Um, and I'm going to skip to the next slide. So some other things to take into consideration are just color blindness. I think it's always useful to look at, and this is something that you can do pretty easily in the accessibility features of PowerPoint. Look at the black and white scale and see if there are distinctions between them. This is also from the open education resource, some examples of different types of color blindness. I think that the biggest thing with color blindness is that it's more common than you would think and much more nuanced. So it's helpful to, again, consider what that if what that looks like with black and white. It's also useful because students don't always have access to color printers, and so sometimes they're printing things out in black and white, and so having those considerations can be helpful as you're going through. I know that in this case it's two different colors, so it's not as challenging, but there are also a number of websites that you can go to get color blind friendly color palettes as well. And again, this is what I said from the last slide, just if you removed all color from the figure, would you still be able to distinguish between the colors? I think what's nice is because there's so many conversations happening around accessibility, it's getting more and more, it's getting easier to find color blindness palettes that are acceptable. I will note in this case, I have not had as much luck using AI to create color blind friendly color palettes. And I think that's kind of interesting because even if you give the specific colors and say, could you redo this figure using these specific colors, it still doesn't do a great job. And it's depends on your AI and depends on the day. It's always getting better, but you can't always going to AI to ask it to modify the colors could be a useful thing to do, but it's still not the best at doing things like that. The other thing that, again, just to consider on a regular basis is just the cognitive load of what you're showing. This is an AI generated figure that was sort of like over the top with arrows everywhere and just, showing something that I didn't want to, pick something that was real and say, this is a horrible example of cognitive load for a figure, but it's really useful to go through and kind of follow your steps, follow your arrows, and again think about, is that information actually useful for my students or for the person I've created the figure for? And if as you're walking through it you get lost, then it's just something to think about and say, maybe this isn't the best figure that I should be using for this context. Like I said in the beginning, a picture is worth 1,000 words, but you typically don't need all that information. So starting with naming the purpose. Why am I showing this figure? What is the core part? Am I really focusing on, in this case, the active site of the protein, or what information do I want the students to get out of it? Directing attention. This is especially important for novices. In working on this OER project, when working with the biomole viz group, one of the things that they really wanted to do was, help students to identify the salient pieces of the protein in the context of what they were working on. When when you are starting off, that's not as easy to do. And so thinking about ways of directing the student's attention, and ideally at some point you realize that if all students had access to the alt text, that would make their lives easier. And then thinking about what are the key takeaways that you can reinforce in words for the third step. So this is, I tried to make it a sort of simple questions to ask as you're going through. I think that one of the things to consider is that, you don't have a lot of time if you are creating a very visual slide deck to write the alt text. So what are some simple questions that you can ask as you're going to address the key takeaways? Again, I think I've already said this, but I think alt text can also be used as a diagnostic tool to figure out, is there lack of clarity in terms of the figure? And if you can't change the figure, then there is probably lack of clarity for everyone. And so adding additional information, adding labels or adding things or adding additional text that can help the individual to navigate that figure, even if they're not using the alt text, can be a useful thing. So another thing that I do on a regular basis, and that I've done when I have been working with students in the past, is having them help me with making my courses more accessible, getting their opinion on things. But I also would argue that having students generate alt text can be a very useful exercise for them, because many times when we are giving students visuals in our disciplines, their ability to interpret what is the most important aspect of the figure that they need to be focusing on is actually aligns quite nicely with the learning objectives for the course. And so creating an assessment where you give students figures and ask them to write the alt text, to me is a reasonable assessment to give them. And in some cases, if you get permission from them, you can actually use that alt text. It might be better than what you can generate. You can use that moving forward. What I also realize is that this is only an assignment that you could give to students who are able to actually see the figure, right? And so the way that this assignment is designed, it might not be accessible for students who are blind or have low vision. But so I as I was designing this slide deck, I was thinking about, well, what's the alternative? And again, it goes back to what are the learning objectives for the exercise? And so for a student who is relying on alt text to interpret a figure, you can think about giving them a more complex version of alt text and asking them to simplify it. In some respects, it actually has the same learning objective, where they're able to consolidate and identify what are the most important parts of the alt text that I should be focusing on. We've been trained to typically have shorter alt text. Again, that's not always possible with more complex figures, but the student so this, if the student is relying on alt text to interpret figures, giving them the skills to be able to practice that idea of consolidating to the most salient points can be a useful exercise as well. And so that's kind of the accessible version of this assignment as well. And it doesn't have to be just for students that are blind or have low vision. You could ask all your students to go from figure to alt text and alt text to figure and think about it that way. And I think that I would argue that that actually helps to build neural pathways and processing for students as they are as they're building their skills from novice to expert. So again, the take home message here is just alt text has the potential to have students demonstrate their content knowledge. And I think that that's in some cases harder to capture. I've done a lot of science outreach and in teaching, and sometimes you don't always know the image that the student is generating in their head and what they're thinking. And so this is also a way of potentially addressing misconceptions that students might have as they're engaging with content. And uh, I and I got ahead of myself on that, but if they are struggling to write that alt text, that's a moment where you can where you can consider, do they even know what the purpose of the figure is? Are they able to just to identify why that figure is important in that context? What are the features that they might not have correctly identified? Um, are they able to describe orientation and things like that when it is contextually important? Is the student able to interpret what the color actually means? And if the student just kind of lists out the elements of the figure, but doesn't actually give the scientific explanation for the figure or the relevant explanation for the figure, that's another opportunity where you might say, oh, we might want to revisit this and give some additional feedback to the student to figure out where they're getting stuck. I think that especially again working with the biomolvis group, the whole purpose of the creation of that group was to teach students more molecular visualization literacy, and so it's something that has been overlooked in teaching, and so considering how you can make that a learning opportunity and how you can make these things learning opportunities for everyone can be useful. Um, and you can also create rubrics that also communicate to the students where they might be struggling in terms of, or where they might be excelling in terms of describing the figures and giving their attention. And so, there's multiple different ways that places where you could use this activity. You could use it as an entry-level task. It might also help you to early on have students identify misconceptions. What are they focusing on? What are the visual aspects of the figure that they're most concerned about? But then you have the potential to use it as in exams, or if you use muddiest points where you ask the students things like what do you need clarification on? But as with all learning, it is a revision cycle, and in addition to everything else, promoting students going through that iterative process is really valuable, I think. And let me just see. Um, I'm going to wrap up there, but because I do want to leave enough time for questions. I know I've already addressed a number of questions, but I also know the chat has been super active, so I'm happy to take this time to consider other questions that you all might have. And thank you for your attention. And that's just my contact information if you want to follow up with me as well. But happy to switch over to answer questions.
If we missed something in the chat, feel free to come off mute and ask your question, anything you need clarified. There were some images that Kristen, you had gone through on your slides that if we could, I don't know if other people wanted to like spend a little more time on why you gave it the alt text you gave it. Maybe that would be helpful in describing the images. I'm not sure if everyone is able to identify the images that you have on the slides. So maybe you could talk through that would be my wish, as you could tell us like your thinking behind why you did what you did. But there might be other questions which I just saw come through, so defer.
Yeah, I guess let's start with the questions in the chat, but I'm also happy to do that as well. Do you mind reading them to me because
Oh, of course, yes. So
sorry.
Kevin asked, is there a tool or one of the common AIs that, even if quite imperfect, can help check through old existing content and graphics for such accessibility examples that could go through 30 lectures and create starter alt text and or flag existing alt text that is likely insufficient. So I think we're looking for some batch alt text checks. That's what that would come off to me as a question. Okay.
Yeah, not that I know of, unfortunately. I know that you can you know, you typically you have to go presentation by presentation to note what that would look like, but at least identify where you need to add alt text. Something that I learned in making this presentation, which I thought was pretty cool, is that when I was copying and pasting figures from the open education resource, the alt text was actually carrying over with the figures. And I was really happy to learn that because it not only saved me a lot of time, but um, I would also consider going back to the sources. And it isn't necessarily, it will still take time, but um, as we move forward with Title II and things like that, individuals are getting better at adding alt text to things. And so alt text might not have existed for that content in the past, but you might go back to the original source and see if alt text has been added. It's not going to help you go through 30 PowerPoint slides, but if it's a difference between, having to write it all yourself and copying and pasting it so that you at least have somewhere to start, that is another thing that might be helpful. And there's probably folks here that are a lot more technical that could probably write a code. I think somebody said that in the chat, write a code to do something like that. I will say that I do have a decent amount of luck when I'm creating not technical scientific figures, but if I'm creating like an infographic, especially if I had the AI create the figure to begin with, it does do a pretty decent job of writing alt text for it and writing longer descriptions and things like that. So that is another thing to consider as you move forward. Other questions?
Yeah, we have a few here. This is from Amy. Outside of the classroom, do you find that the scientific journals or conferences are providing helpful information about alt text? Are they requiring that yet?
They're getting better. I can tell you that I am in my role on the Chemists with Disabilities Committee for the American Chemical Society. We are actively partnering with American Chemical Society journals to not only actively add alt text to figures that are coming out for more recent articles, but also figuring out the process of going back and having alt text added for previous journal submissions. And I also know that folks that are on the committee are also talking to folks at Science as well to work on that. The thing that gets challenging with alt text that is generated for scientific journals is that it is the best person to write the alt text is typically the person who wrote the article, and going back to them is not necessarily feasible. And so trying to backfill that has its challenges, but I do know that at least those two organizations are actively working on how to best move forward with it. And it's one of those things where they are considering what are the you know uh where are good places to start. I think that in general they were starting to, at least for the American Chemical Society, they were looking at some of the books that they were publishing first to make the process more streamlined, and then moving that more towards their journals. But it is definitely a process, and they are also actively creating resources for generating alt text, along with, I think there's some folks that I know that are also partnering with IUPAC as well. So it's a work in progress. I think the challenge is, you're not if things aren't being released, you're not necessarily seeing it, but I know that there are active conversations in all those areas.
Okay, we have some more questions coming in. Thank you so much for that. And people are responding. Brooke asked, can we use the description under the picture image, for example, from a text as alt text? Would we have to cite it if we copy and paste it?
If you're getting the image from a source, you're already probably citing where that source came from. So if you're using that text, it's probably the same process as citing the original figure. The only time I would discourage that, so if you're using that as part of your, like, if you're making a PowerPoint slide deck, that would be fine, but you don't want to have the image description be identical to the alt text if you're making like a textbook or something like that, because then it's just going to read the same content twice, which isn't helpful for the folks that are using the screen reader.
Okay, and Mason asks, do you have any advice for balancing quality and efficiency of alt text? As someone who has inherited lecture slides for multiple organic chemistry classes with hundreds of images and structures, it's a bit overwhelming seeing the mountain of images I need to make accessible with only so much time to become Title II compliant.
Yeah. I can tell you, my folks in my center, where I'm at now, are unfortunately, organic chemistry is one of the last courses that they're actually looking at, there's this really interesting thing that happens where chemists are afraid of accessibility and accessibility people are afraid of chemists. And so you end up with this nice little void that happens. Not sarcasm there. But I think that a good place to start is if you and I know that you don't always have the name of the image of the molecule, but seeing if you can find like alt text for, say, sucrose. It will be clunky, but you can start there, or you can also ask AI to, say, give you a starting point library for that type of thing. Again, in those cases, if you have access to a textbook or something like that, you might go back to the textbook to see if some of those images, if the authors have added alt text for those images as well. And so that can kind of give you that starting point. But for some of the more common structures, you might be able to either Google and or use AI to say, I would like this structure. The most important thing if you're using AI is to give context to the students that you are serving. So, and to the time point in the semester. So, you're going to want to have more complicated alt text in the beginning of the semester, and then you might even be able to wean that off a little bit as you progress through the semester, because the students are are more familiar with the structures, if that makes sense.
I believe we answered all. If we missed it, let us know. There's some great resources being dropped and some back and forth supporting one another with questions and comments. So that's been helpful. Um, Kristen, thank you so much, but I don't want to rush. Does anyone want to come off mute and ask? I don't want to.
Something that I will say, when I was starting to work on the figures for this text, I felt that I was pretty overwhelmed, and I was using AI as a starting point. But then as I went through, and I can kind of go back to the original question about like walking through the process of these figures, one of the things that I started to notice was when I got when I would put it into an AI alt text generator, I started to notice the patterns of what um, of writing the alt text. And what ended up happening was towards probably figure 100 or so, I got to the point where I was just writing. It was easier for me to just write it myself because I started to notice those patterns. I started to notice the features. And so it does get easier as you do it. That first 100 or so figures, it's painful, but especially if they are of the same nature, figuring out kind of what those key points of the figures are can be really useful. And again, as they say with I think with accessibility, we're heading in the right direction. And so there's going to be more and more resources that come out that just make things easier for us to meet those accessibility guidelines.
So you went to slide 12 and you were going to talk through this image. Can
Yeah.
you talk us through what the weak one, the strong one, and then describe that image of why you did what you did? That'd be helpful.
So yeah, so giving doing just saying that something is a screenshot isn't helpful because it doesn't capture what the actual process is. Um, but here, if you the biggest thing when you're looking at screenshots is making sure that, especially if you've labeled things, that those labels are prevalent in the figure. Something to also consider is what is the order in which you hope that the student navigates through that figure? Is there a specific order? We talk about that when we talk about PowerPoint accessibility. So is there do you just go in a certain clockwise or counterclockwise, or is there a um, more oriented process to navigating through those to those things. It can also be helpful if you actually go to the website and tab through the website and see what the student might experience if they are so when you tab through, it'll show you the logical order that the students are going to go through it. And so that's another thing to consider when you are generating the alt text as well. Uh, does that kind of help with that?
Yeah, no, I was hoping you describe on the screen, you have a screenshot. Could you describe what the screenshot is and why you named it what you did? And I think I hear you, but I think I'm looking for the step by step. You gave a weak and a strong, and then
Yeah.
you described if you could describe the actual image to everyone, and then also give us why you gave it the strong alt text would be
Uh,
great. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. So the stronger alt text has all of the text that in this case it's a like light purple text. So it goes through and describes that the drop down menu is highlighted, that the toolbar is highlighted. There's a structural view of the protein, command line, recent models, and model panel, command log, and select bar. I actually, as I'm going back through this, I would probably again if I wanted to be even further strengthen it, would go back and see how someone with a screen reader is navigating that particular website. But something that I didn't include, I think that this is the more important part. I didn't include some of the text that is also on the screen. I didn't include the individual drop down. Like if I clicked on help, I didn't include the options there, but things that are also on the screen, like open and save and things like that. Because that's not the purpose of this figure. The purpose of the figure is not to have the student navigate through all of the features of the toolbar. The purpose of this figure is to know that if you are on this website, that the fig that these features are on the website. And the other piece is things like the exact protein that is being, in this case, it's a glucokinase. That is not something that is important in this context. And so that's text that I would say doesn't need to be included in the alt text. So making decisions about, does every single word that is in the figure need to be in the alt text? No, it's really about what are you hoping that the student gets out of the figure? And why are you including that figure? Does that kind of help?
It does. Yeah, I wanted you to walk through because not we, I wasn't able to, I don't know what any of this is. I don't have any chemistry background. So just hearing you talk through, and I think, hearing you talk like about the context, right? So it matters, and having that knowledge of why and what something is super helpful when writing the alt text. So awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks again to everyone for joining me today. I hope this was helpful. And I think that, the biggest thing is just you're not alone in this, and this is hard. It's not an easy thing. This is not something that we were taught as scientists. This is not something that we were taught as educators. And this is, yet another one of the many things that have shaped up education in the last few years. But coming to things like this and doing the work is really useful. So thank you everyone for taking the time to dedicate an hour or more if you've attended the other sessions to thinking through this topic.
Kristen, we dropped your email in the chat. I'll also put your LinkedIn in if you want to connect with Kristen on LinkedIn. You can do that, and just really appreciate it. This is one of the topics that I know has been on people's mind and in our Slack community, kind of looking for resources. And so truly appreciate all of your expertise in the area. And thank you everyone for your continued participation in the series. This wraps up 2026, and we'll see you in 2027. Have a great day, everyone. Talk to you
Thank you,
soon.
Nicole.
Bye.
Bye.